Alright, folks, today I want to show you a little bit about the work of the Australian artist Stelarc. He was born in 1946 in Cyprus and later moved to the Melbourne area of Australia. He lived there for some time. He also lived for a while in Japan. His name was Stelios Arcadio, but he changed it legally to Stelarc. And he is famous for saying the body is obsolete. And we'll talk about that more at the end, what that means in terms of his philosophy and outlook for humanity. He's a research fellow at Curtin University and has won a Pre-Ars Prize, which is a very prestigious award for electronic arts. His website is stelarc.org, and that's where I've gotten most of the images and videos you see in this presentation. He started by doing performance work with his body, and a lot of those performances involved a suspension practice where you take metal hooks that are sharp and you actually stick them through the skin and tie ropes on them and then lift the body up in space. So it's hanging by these flesh hooks. He did over 25 of these suspension performances, and you can see in this one here, he's counterbalanced the weight of his body with this circle of stones to hold him up, and it looks a bit meditative there. And I think it's important to start with these works of his where he does the suspensions because it gives you a sense of his thinking about the body from very early on. He thinks about the body the way a performance artist thinks about the body. He wants to activate the body in his work, similar to how a dancer or athlete activates the body in their work, but he's doing it from an arts perspective. He sees the body as sculpture when he does these pieces, and is interested in how the body occupies space then as a sculptural object. So he tries to make them like specific to the sites where he does these suspensions. He's done them like in trees and construction sites and other things like that. He does not see the body as like personality or personified or gendered the way we might interpret the body. So the first of his mechanical art pieces I'll show you is Third Hand, which he worked on from 1980 to 2002. And as you can see, it is in fact a third hand. It attaches to one of his arms, and the fingers of the third hand are controlled by the muscles in his other arm and in his leg. And you can see in the photo here these little circle dots with the wires connecting to them, and then up here too. Those are muscle sensors, so they're measuring the electric pulses of the muscles when they're tensed or relaxed. So by flexing the muscles in his thigh or arm, he can control the fingers on the third hand. And this is actually one of the ways that they are now making prosthetic limbs for folks, and how they would control the fingers of a prosthetic with other muscles. And it takes a bit of learning to do this, right? You have to kind of remap your brain to think, that this muscle equates to this other kind of motion. And as you see here, it allows him to write 3 times as fast as normal folk because he can write with all 3 hands. And this gets to one of his ideas about the body, or one of his critiques of the body, is that it's not modular. It's not easy to adapt the body. So like if you wanted a different kind of hand or a different style of leg, you can't just like take the one you have off and put a new one on. But his work with the third hand is kind of trying to envision what that may look like, or a way that may look like. So I would say he's very much into the like cyborg philosophy described by Haraway. From 2002 to 2003, he worked on Muscle Machine, and I have a little video of this one for you. It's a hexapod robot that he is like strapped into and can pivot around on, and he's controlling how it's walking around. He has another like augmented key device on one of his arms. You can see the cord there requires a significant amount of power and pneumatics to work. So it's got a tether. And it aesthetically is kind of like the stuff that nightmares are made out of, right? But again, he's thinking about like other ways to propel the body through space and to augment our capabilities with an exoskeleton-like structure. And again, he uses this in a performative aspect. So he builds these like cyborg extensions of himself, and then does a performance piece with them. These are two of my favorites of his stomach sculpture and Blender. Stomach sculpture's on the left here. It's this little capsule. You're seeing it in its expanded state. Those three metal like fins fold down and make it into like a pill-like shape, the whole thing. And his motivation for stomach sculpture were severalfold. He wanted to make art for the microbial life in his body. Sorry, I'm just not sure what that noise is. I'm not sure if you can hear it. Sorry about that. He wanted to make sculpture for the microbial life in his stomach, in his gut, the little bacteria and other organisms that help him digest. He felt bad that they don't get to experience art, so he made this sculpture for them. And it's this pill form. He swallows it. It's also tethered. And then when it's in his stomach, it opens up, and it has a LED kind of light show that it does, and there's a little piezo speaker on there. It makes some sound and does a little performance, of audiovisual performance for the microbial life in his stomach. So that was the sculpture that he made for within the body. He also wanted to do the opposite and make a sculpture of the body from within and bringing it to the outside. So he collaborated with Nina Stelarc on Blender, which is on the right there. And you can see it's got these gas canisters here. There's a clear sphere at the top, and there's a propeller at the bottom that will occasionally come on to churn the fluid in the sphere to keep it active and mixed. The fluid in the sphere are like fats and lipid samples from Stelarc's stomach and Nina's thighs, I believe. So they both had some liposuction surgeries, and then took the material that was removed and put it into this sculpture. And so the pressurized system here and the propeller and all that helps keep those samples like fresh, so they don't decay. Now that they're outside of the body. And these sculptures go together in my mind because they're both about breaking like the barrier of the skin. And we can think of the skin in all kinds of ways, but it's this surface that separates us from the outside world, right? And the things that are within the skin are personal to us, and the things without are in like the public sphere. So in that sense too, he's also blurring what it means for something to be public or private, by taking material from within himself and making it public, right? Or taking something from the outside world and putting it within his body. He's breaking that barrier in both directions, which is pretty interesting to me. So then, this is the last piece I'm going to tell you about, his piece, Ear on Arm. This is what he's most famous for. You may have seen this piece before in reference to Stelarc. He worked on this from 2003 to 2012. And you can see on his forearm there is an ear. The ear is not grown on him necessarily. It's a silicone implant ear, mostly. Unlike some of the more recent experiments of like growing ears on the backs of rats. But he did something really interesting with this piece. He was again thinking of that public-private divide, and he wanted to make a public space within his own body. So like to give a public ear, as it were. So when he initially had the surgery done, there was a Bluetooth microphone implanted within the ear itself. So the ear could actually listen. The microphone would connect to the internet whenever he was in an area that had Wi-Fi, and stream whatever the ear was hearing to the internet. So you could go to the website, log on, and listen to what Stelarc's arm ear was hearing, right? So that's pretty fascinating, and that brings in all kinds of questions about privacy. And it's particularly interesting to me today because we've essentially done this with our Internet of Things devices, right? Like if you have an Amazon Alexa or a Google Home or use Siri or any of these other things, like you're inviting these corporations to put a device in your living place to listen to everything that you do there, right? Stelarc was doing something similar, except he's not a corporation, right? He was doing it from an artistic perspective. As part of this, there was a second part to this project that he hasn't realized yet, but he also wanted to sort of do the opposite of this, right? Like he did stomach sculpture and Blender, but to put in one of his teeth a speaker, so that he could connect to like his phone, and you could call him, and he could, when you talked, he would hear your voice like within his head, right? Because it's like a bone conducting speaker from his tooth, and the vibrations would be like right there with him. So it'd feel like incredibly weird, or like you were literally talking inside of his skull. That's when his mouth's closed. The fascinating part then is if he opens his mouth, the sound would be projected, right? The oral cavity of his mouth would project the sound outward, and other people would be able to hear the conversation, like if you put your phone on speakerphone. Now, what makes that really interesting to me is whose words then are they, right? Who's responsible for those words? If someone says something on the phone, but it comes out of Stelarc's mouth, did Stelarc say those words? They're coming out of his body. Or did the person on the phone say those words, even though they might not be in the same physical location, right? And so, like, in terms of responsibility, if Stelarc says something incredibly offensive or something incredibly wise, do we attribute that to Stelarc or the voice on the other end of the line? It's a really interesting question of authorship then. Uh, Unfortunately, the microphone for the ear, I think he had an infection with that shortly after it was done, and that had to be removed, but he's been thinking about getting that put back in and finishing up this project. So I wanted to end with a little discussion of his philosophy that the body is obsolete, and he says this: the desire to locate the self simply within a particular biological body is no longer meaningful. What it means to be human is being constantly redefined. So Stelarc sees the body as problematic, right? The body is flawed, the body is weak, it gets sick, it decays, it gets old. It's not modular, it's not renewable. He's also really concerned with how the bodies serve as like a filter to our conscious understanding of the world around us, right? Our bodies occupy a certain amount of space. They allow us to do a certain range of motions that allow us to engage in certain kinds of activities. Our 5 sensory perceptions allow us to perceive the world around us in a kind of particularly limited way. So our whole understanding of the world from his view is very human centric, right? Like we understand the world because we're humans, and we can only understand them in that way. Like we have like almost no real like understanding of what it would mean to be a bird and be able to fly as freely as they do, or like what kind of energy that takes. Just as an example. So from his view, if we want to have radically new philosophies, if we want to have radically new outlooks, then we must radically transform the body's capabilities. As an example, right? Machines now are more precise, they're more powerful, they're faster, and they store more knowledge than the human body can. So should we be designing technologies to fit the body using the laws of ergonomics, or should we flip that around and be redesigning the body to take maximum advantage of the technologies that we have access to, since the technologies are evolving so much faster than we are? It's also important to point out that Stelarc does not see a separation of mind and body. He doesn't want to like chop off his head and put it on a robot. That's not what he's talking about here. The body and the mind, or the body and the brain, are one organism. They're not. You can't pull those things apart. That idea that they're separate, that there's a mind and a body, is a relic of Cartesian dualistic philosophy that is quite rejected at this point in time, actually. So he wants to figure out, how do we plug the body in, right? Like, how do we plug the body in and incorporate it into the machinic world rather than seeing it as somehow separate